I'd say a lot of that is the worry, too, of what could come down the line. Things like the PRO Act, by the way, there's too much right now on that. And that's a concern. Let me give you a really good example. I have a member of ours who's a pretty large logistic company, transportation, semi-trucks, all kinds of things, right? And something like 70% of their operations are through independent contractors. The reality is a lot of independent contractors, these are people who will say they own their own semi-truck, so they have their own LLC, and they say, hey, we want to do only the jobs we want to do, we'll pick and choose. And a lot of logistics companies work this way. If the PRO Act, which is a national effort to duplicate some things that happen in California, because we all know California usually has the best business policy, will take away this ability for independent contractors to even exist. We're talking 70% of just this one company's business operations.
Americans are capable of achieving extraordinary things when they have the freedom and opportunity to do so. This is American Potential. And here's your host, Jeff Crank.
Well, thanks for being with us for another episode of American Potential. You know, when an entrepreneur sets out to start a business, it takes a significant amount of time, energy, and even sweat equity to turn their vision into reality. And there's a long to-do list before even opening the doors, you know, from making sure the business is legally able to operate to setting up the physical space. Pricing strategies are a crucial part of that process, and that involves numerous factors to ensure that customers keep coming back. Now, some of these factors include operating costs, material expenses, labor costs, and industry-specific regulatory fees, among other things. Imagine all of that just to open a business in the United States. But what happens if one of these costs increases? Sometimes a business will try to absorb that cost, but if they can't, that cost gets passed on to the consumer. For instance, a restaurant owner in Georgia wrote an article explaining why his restaurant charges $16 for a BLT sandwich and why they had to raise prices over the past few years. So as business owners try to keep their business afloat, it would be a little frustrating to hear a lawmaker accuse them of raising prices because they're being greedy and not due to circumstances that are out of their control. In Pennsylvania, there's an association which represents multiple types of businesses. And they hear from each industry about the impacts of how regulations and rising costs are affecting their business. I want to welcome Jezree Friend, who is the Vice President of External Relations for Manufacturer and Business Association that's located in Pennsylvania. Jezree, thanks for being with us.
Jeff, thanks so much for having us. We're really excited to be here today.
Yeah, you know, I love the intro that we gave because you know, it's funny that a lawmaker would try and accuse a business owner of just being greedy when in a lot of cases, it's the government that's being so darn greedy with their regulation and the taxes and the fees and everything else that causes these products to go up in price. There's a little bit of irony in that, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, they know so little about so little things, I found. I used to be, when I first got into this world, Jeff, I used to be intimidated, I guess, about the lawmakers, the elected officials. I was a political science major, right? So every good political science major thought they'd be kid president one day. And then I got into this position to advocate for businesses, and I found out they don't know, these lawmakers, so many of them have no idea what they're talking about. And I very quickly no longer became intimidated because they're just people. And unfortunately, by the way, at the expenses of the small businesses, at the expenses of our economy, they don't know what they don't know. And so it's incumbent on organizations like ours to help provide that education.
Yeah. And I would say, you know, there's a lot of lawmakers that, and I've met lots of them, and sometimes they think they know what's best, but a lot of them at least have the humility, and these are the really good ones, the lawmakers who have the humility to say, you know what, I'm not an expert on this industry or this sector of the economy, and so I need you to tell me kind of what you need to be successful in business and provide jobs and those sorts of things. But a lot of times you get the arrogance of legislators maybe thinking they know what every sector of the economy needs.
Yeah, no doubt. And it's unfortunate when we see lawmakers honestly just make these baseless comments on blaming small businesses for causes of inflation, something we're very opposed to these lazy and they are cheap political talking points, which is unfortunate that so many of our small businesses, which by the way, make up the backbone of our economy. Without these small businesses, we're not talking about the giant conglomerates here, right? These are the ones who, they sponsor your kids' little league baseball teams. They're the ones who know all their employees by name. They're the ones who are actually vested in our communities. And so to kind of harp on these folks for political gain and, I don't know, fundraising emails maybe, I take offense to personally. And I think it's lazy.
Yeah. Now talk a little bit about the Manufacturer and Business Association and what you focus on.
Love to. So our mission at the Manufacturer and Business Association, we refer to it often as MBA, which sometimes is confused, but check out the acronym. But at the MBA here, we want to see our business members thrive within the free market system. Hard stop. So everything we can do to make that happen, that's what we're for. Anything that would deter from those things, that's what we're against. And we do that providing a lot of services and things of that nature to help our business members succeed along the way through a variety of avenues, whether it's human resource, like HR resources, insurance resources, all kinds of the things that businesses need to be successful at doing their business. But in addition to that, we have a very strong government advocacy, very involved government advocacy arm as well, purely focused on advancing the needs and raising and voicing the concerns of these businesses at both the state level government here in Pennsylvania, as well as with our federal delegation in Pennsylvania and DC as well.
Yeah. What are some of the issues that I think businesses are facing right now?
And there's a lot, and it hasn't gotten easier the last couple of years. Some of the easiest are the low-hanging fruit that you hear about a lot. I'll tell you two, and then one that you might not have heard as much about. First two being workforce. You're hearing that everywhere. It's cutting across industries, whether you're in manufacturing, whether you're in retail. People just can't get enough workers. And I'll tell you, some of these manufacturers specifically, they could just turn their spigot is turned like the nozzle halfway off. If they could just get some of the workers back, that thing would just come rushing. And I think our U.S. economy would just go gangbusters. So the potential is there. It's sitting like roaring, revving up, ready to just go. We just need the people. And should some of that come to fruition, I think we're going to see a real big boon here in the U.S. So that's a big one. We can get into more details on why we see some of that. But some of the other things is no doubt inflation. Inflation is just wasn't in the business plan for a lot of businesses. And so there's a lot of readjusting we're seeing happening. And my third thing, I said, it's not being talked about as much, but I think is huge. It's one of the largest line items for businesses, especially those that are looking to grow, looking to retain good employees. And that is the incredible, unsustainably rising costs of health insurance, specifically for small businesses in America.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that is a growing concern, and we've talked about it on this program before. I think Republicans haven't had the greatest answer on healthcare. They've been opposed to Obamacare and things like that. We supported Americans for Prosperity, something called the personal option, which is a bunch of free market reforms, right? Expanding health savings accounts and increasing direct primary care, and a whole host of other reforms that can be done, greater transparency and scope of practice and things like that. But there do need to be, we can't just say, we don't want government run healthcare. That's not a solution because that's not helping businesses. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you hit the nail on the head. Is that open option is free markets.
Right.
Time and time again, when there's more options, businesses competing with each other, it brings the cost down. And you mentioned, you said the word Obamacare. We romantically refer to it, but also more formally known as the Affordable Care Act.
Right.
Ironically, the Affordable Care Act was anything but that.
Right.
And I'll give you a specific story, Jeff, that's not talked about as much as I think it should be. Is one of the provisions caused in the Affordable Care Act, it made it so that small businesses, it took away the option. We talked about having more options. This reduced options as unnecessary regulation. It reduced the option to allow small businesses. When I say small, I'm saying like 50 or less employees, the ability to aggregate together and purchase health insurance like a larger employers currently do. And what that does is it took away their economies of scale. It took away their purchasing power, and then additionally added a lot of unnecessary regulations to have that insurance. There's been recent developments that kind of opened up some of that competition. And unfortunately, just this past year, officially a new rule came down from the Biden administration in January that has now made it 33 states has some sort of arrangement to allow these, kind of like an association health plan sort of arrangement. The Biden administration decided in its infinite wisdom with small business that they weren't going to allow that to happen anymore. And now those are all gone. So at a time.
And again, we ought to be offering more options instead of fewer. I think the reason the government did that is there are people out there who believe in a single payer system. They want a government run system, and they don't want other things to succeed and show that, private health insurance has its problems, but it's way better than a government-run, one-size-fits-all system. So, we continue to have that. I do want to talk to you, though, before we get too far into that. We can come back to that if we have time. But, there are lawmakers. This is the point of this whole podcast. It just amazes me. There are some lawmakers saying that prices of goods are going up because business owners are being greedy. Now, explain why that is just not the case.
Well, Jeff, for anyone that's got 3 minutes and an online access to YouTube, there's some really cute cartoon videos that explains the causes of inflation and why prices increase. The reality is the government can't keep printing more money and expecting this thing to magically happen, right? The reality is these small businesses are getting the squeeze and have to pass things on. The reality is a lot of these businesses, their margins, by the way, of profit are very, very small. So yes, they might say, oh, you're seeing these larger numbers in net or in gross revenues. But the reality is there's a lot of taxes that keep going up, by the way. They have to, pay employees to work. And there's a lot of other business expenses that come with that. So their profit margins are very, very narrow. So in order to still have a business and maintain a workforce that provides for our economy, as those costs have increased on the business owner, it's being passed on to either the consumer or as well as just tightening their belts on hiring freezes, maybe growing their operations, things like that. The reality is that's cheap political talking points used at the expense of small business. And I'll say this, every red-blooded American business owner in America should take absolute, offense to this and honestly should speak out more than just organizations like ours who are more than willing to. But it does mean a lot when it comes right from them directly and provide that transparency on the reality here.
Yeah. And you have, what the irony of that is that you have the federal government, which spends trillions of dollars a year, blame. And again, we all know that inflation is caused by government, as you said, government printing too much money. But they're printing trillions of it, yet they have the gall to turn around and blame kind of a mom and pop business that's just, trying to eke out a living. And somehow on that scale, people are supposed to believe that versus this small mom and pop store versus the federal government that's spending trillions of dollars a year. Who are we going to blame here for inflation? It's just, it doesn't even stand up to the facts when you look at it.
Yeah, and it's surprising how often the government expects people to just blindly trust them.
Right.
And we just think that they're not lying to us. I heard it explained to me this way, and I reciprocate this kind of mentality. I got 3 children. I love them dearly. Sometimes I don't always tell them the truth on things because it's just the way of the world. You're going to tell me that the government's out here batting 1,000? I don't believe it.
Yeah.
What's the Ronald Reagan line? Trust me, I'm from the government and I'm here to help.
That's right. Yeah. Well, and as you look at this, just to walk through the basics, right? If you sell hot dogs and you have to pay, your labor costs go up. The price of a hot dog has to go up, and it isn't your fault that the labor cost goes up. Whose fault is it? It might be the government's printing a lot more money, putting that out into the economy, and other things are costing more because people have more money to spend to buy big screen TVs and go get a different car and things like that. So that's causing a small business to now have to pay more for an employee. These are just things that average everyday Americans have to deal with. But it seems bureaucrats in Washington or in state capitals around the country, they don't have to deal with that. They just the money just keeps coming, right? Yeah.
And it's funny, it'd be a lot easier if there was less of them and less of those things doing these sorts of things. But the reality is whenever they, for instance, we're dealing with an upcoming state budget in Pennsylvania here, and there's an ungodly billions with a B dollars of they want to add to the annual budget. I have never seen and I'm not doing this a long time, but I've also read a lot, years of a government going and spending less after they've initially spent more. And it just keeps going and going, and there's no end on any of it. And so that's why our organization fights against reasonable regulations. We're not saying no regulations, but we kind of have some reasonable in there. The problem that we constantly run into is I actually have a little nifty sign in my boss's office. It says, "Are you using logic?" It's a little arrow. If yes, stop immediately. If no, you're on the right track when dealing with the government. It's absolutely crazy.
Yeah. So let's talk about Bidenomics a bit. Bidenomics, how big of an impact in your mind has Bidenomics had on businesses across America?
Yeah, well, it's terrible, right? Let's just get right to it. The reality is when we had, and now I'll say in addition to that, I think what's included in the Bidenomics is this refusal to extend the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act provisions. Right. There is a lot of uncertainty around that still. And so for businesses, there's a lot of uncertainty on what's going to happen, down the road. The reality is, the number was commercial and industrial loans just this past year has dropped over 5%. And so about 8% for inflation, right? If you're looking to grow and expand your business by getting those loans to invest back in yourselves, this isn't a good sign for investors looking to expand business operations in the U.S. when we are having this kind of negative outlook by the Biden administration on things like expansion or just continuing Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. You asked, what are some of the effects on these businesses? The reality is back in 2019, businesses are going big gangbusters, and across the board, industries were setting record years for profits, job growth, passing, by the way, and this is where I push back too, is this whole greedy business owner, whatever. We have a lot of business members in our organization across Pennsylvania, but also in Ohio and New York as well. We did a lot of research and survey amongst our members and the general business community as a whole, and we found overwhelmingly, it was over 90-some% after the 2019 surge of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act implementation. All those profits, et cetera, that and the gangbusters that the business were going, they were using that and investing back in their people, backing their workforce, hiring more people, giving raises. And this is completely contradictory to what we were being told. Things that these greedy business owners are just keeping their profits for themselves and yada, 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 fill in the blank. The reality is the facts don't match up with the political talking points.
Yeah. Well, and look, as government takes more in taxes, and you just talked about the extension of the tax cuts, as government takes more, businesses have less to reinvest into their workforce, into their facilities, into their business. I mean, that's just common sense. You talked about extending the tax cuts. And of course, those were the Trump tax cuts. Those were President Trump pushed those through with Congress. The Biden administration has made it pretty clear that if Joe Biden is reelected, he does not want to extend most of those tax cuts. That would have a profound negative impact on our economy if that were to happen, right?
Oh my gosh, it would be huge. I mean, it takes so much of the investment potential away. It takes away business confidence, by the way, in the market. There's actually freezes starting to go on with some expansion plans just because of that sort of thing. So I don't know why that's not being talked about. And by the way, there's been bad communication on both sides on what it does and what it doesn't do, right? It was supposed to be this, it's only this top whatever percent greedy, whatever. Stop saying greedy business owner in front of it. That is an adjective that is an outlier and not the, I believe, an outlier and not the main reason, right? business owners, what we need to say is thanking them a little more, right, for providing jobs for our economy, for providing jobs so we can take care of our families. And so we, majority of Americans, aren't business owners. That we don't have to put on all the risk that these business owners do and take on themselves. And if this stuff doesn't, if the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act do not extend, we are going to be looking at pretty terrible economic numbers for some years to come. I do think if we can extend this, it'll be at least one other arrow in our quiver to help fight back against some of these inflation problems that we're seeing.
Yeah. Isn't this a tactic, though, that politicians use all the time, is to deflect and blame someone else, right? If the economy isn't going well, or inflation, as we have right now, high inflation, and it's been persistent inflation, and you and I know the dirty little secret, right? That's caused from too much money chasing too few products, and we were coming out of COVID, and the Biden administration put their foot on the gas pedal and said, let's just keep spending at record levels and just insane levels of spending. We all know that is what caused inflation, but yet isn't it just a tactic of I don't know any other way to say it. They're scoundrels, politicians, when they then turn it around and try and not blame their own excess in spending, but try and blame, the little guy, the mom and pop store owner or business in general, and say, well, they're greedy. They have record profits and, those sorts of things. Isn't that just a tactic that many politicians use?
Yeah, I'll take it a step further, Jeff. It's irresponsible, right?
It is.
What's a good leader do as opposed to a non-good leader, right? I spent some time in the military, and we had good sergeants, and we had bad sergeants and commanders, et cetera, right? The good ones are going to equip their people for success. I manage a team here in my current role, right? And I'm not saying I'm the best leader in the world, but I think part of my role in that leadership capacity is to equip my team to be the best versions of themselves, and that anything I can do to help push them to be better, all so that we can achieve our common goal, our mission being to help our business members thrive within that free market system, right?
Yeah.
This approach that we do see that we're talking about right now amongst elected officials by just kind of passing the buck, finger pointing, making up things, is doing nothing to help us, is not doing the things, by the way, that they promised or should have promised in agreeing to run for office. I will say this, we do find it very admirable, and I do personally, anyone that wants to put themselves out there to run for office. It's really important to get really good candidates running for office, because so many times we get B quality candidates to run because the good people often have really good things going on. So why bother all the nonsense, right? And then that B candidate gets elected. I've seen it time and again where sometimes the best candidate doesn't always win. And now we have B tier quality representation representing us, and that has a direct effect on so many more things. So anyone that throws their hat in the ring definitely commands my respect.
Yeah, and look, good people have to step up and run for office, or as you said, we won't. The liberty doesn't survive, freedom doesn't survive, our country doesn't survive if good people don't step up and do that. But it is very frustrating, as you said, and you mentioned politicians who sort of use this, and to me, a good elected official looks at it and says, okay, we have high inflation. Let's figure out what to do about that. We have this issue of uncertainty around whether or not the Trump tax cuts would be extended. What can we do about that to solve it for the American people? But then you have politicians sort of in the other camp that are like, well, it's about me. It's about them getting reelected, right? And trying to figure out who they can blame, to blame for the plight of the current economic situation, or blame for inflation. It's really frustrating, and it highlights, I guess, the fact that we have some politicians who are being responsible, trying to do what's right for the country, and others who just want to lay blame so that they can get reelected.
Yeah, sure. And for people that, when we hear these rhetoric from elected officials here in Pennsylvania, as well as from the president, saying that it's getting better, that the costs are lower.
Sure, because it's election year. That's why they're saying that.
But the reality is, go to the grocery store. You know what I mean?
Right, right.
I've got 3 children. My grocery bill is a lot more than it was just a couple years ago. Yeah. And yes, they've gotten a little older, but let's be real here. It's ridiculous. So I do think this message isn't landing on Americans, or they wouldn't be pushing it as hard,
Right.
trying to say that, oh, hey, this is good for the economy. The reality, all of us, I mean, look at any message board on any news site, go to your local news affiliate for whatever town you live in, look at their Facebook page. Oh, Bidenomics, President Biden says the economy is great. Now go look at the first 19 messages and tell me that they're all saying,
Sure.
yes, this is wonderful. I got a
Right.
giant raise and I'm making more money than ever. The reality is, unless you're getting 19% raises almost year over end, you're not even keeping up with some of this inflation issue, let alone actually getting ahead. And that doesn't even touch the housing market right now, which is bananas.
Right. And look, the American people are smarter than politicians give them credit for. They see this, they see the blame game, but they know, like if you look poll after poll, I mean, I think immigration is the highest in most people's minds right now. That's the biggest problem. People understand that and get it. But right after that is inflation and the economy, right? And so I think the American people, they aren't buffaloed by the politicians who want to sort of do the sleight of hand and say it's somebody else's fault. I think the American people are smart enough to see it and they're focused on it. And I'm sure you've seen that. The association that you work for has done some events with Americans for Prosperity. Talk about those events, what you were highlighting, and what you heard from people who were at those events.
Yeah, we've done a couple just this past year. And so shout out and hat tip to the folks at Americans for Prosperity here in PA. Ashley Klingensmith has got a great team with Mary Beth Cerrucci, and they are all over the state, very impressive. And so we're happy to partner with them in any way we can because of some of that shared mission, us with the tie-in directly to the business community and them with a lot of the grassroots stuff that they're working on to just get the message out. And it's all part of educating, right? So one we just did recently, a great staple in the community up in Erie, Pennsylvania, is called Bellows Market. It's a mom and pop grocery store. I think they're the owners are third generations. They've been around this is so cool, right? So they just celebrated first week of May, their 60th year anniversary being in business.
Wow. That's great.
And it is great. And to tie into that, as we know, as some know, the cost of groceries, we mentioned cost of groceries jumping up. Americans for Prosperity was so gracious is that they bought a lot of gift certificates, right? Or I guess you would call, at the tune of $60 a piece, because the average family per family of four is actually paying an additional $60 per week in the cost of due to inflation and groceries. So what we did is we set up with a partner of ours in Bellows Market and gave out $60 gift cards to everyone coming in who wanted them, which they went pretty quick, and just explain, listen, we think there's a better way. And ironically, it was so poetic how the $60 gift cards represents the difference, and it happened to be Bellows Market's 60th anniversary being in business, and they couldn't have been more excited to help participate in that.
Yeah, well, that's great. And they're survivors for being in business for 60 years and through some of this crazy.
And the margin on for like grocery stores, by the way, sometimes it's under 1%. So they talk about, they're making all this money. It's sometimes under 1%. And so when you're seeing some of that stuff at the grocery store raising, it's because if they don't raise it even just a little bit, unfortunately, they will go out of business. And we won't have those local commerce areas for us to participate in.
Right. And somebody should ask, what's the government's margin on that? Because last I checked, they don't actually pay for any of the product coming in, but they do take a cut. So I'd say their margin's a lot higher than the margin on anything in America. It's sort of amazing. What else did you hear? I mean, people really are hurting, and we talk to families, and it's one of the great things that Americans for Prosperity does, I think, is go and highlight this. They've done it in gas stations and done gas station events and grocery stores where they kind of highlight, this, but it's also fun to help people, right? For at least a week, take their mind off the fact that there has been this inflationary problem in the United States, and that's something that they deal with every single day. It never goes away for them. Tell us what you were hearing from folks at these events.
Yeah, so we also did another event with AFP, and that was a panel we did at Hartman. It's a manufacturer just outside the Pittsburgh area. And that was actually pretty recently. We made a really good turnout for that. And just kind of talking, and that was a little bit more state policy on some of the things that the governor's doing there and some of those hurts. And some of the things we are seeing, I'll say, this is good, Some good things we're seeing is domesticating a lot of our supply chains. We saw during the COVID, just the access to get things was so hard, right? But now there's a real turn and a focus, even with some of the costs, for American manufacturing to really shore up a lot of our resources. And that's going to help us, I think, should anything crazy ever like that happen again. So we talked a lot about some of the supply chain issues at that panel. The other thing is really important, something that we've been working on, and AFP has been helpful to some extent on some of these with us, to help educate our business members, educate their employees, right? Because there's sometimes is maybe a disconnect from the business owner to those who are actually working on how this actually works. So we're providing resources to those business owners specifically. Listen, here's how you can tell your people what's actually going on. You're not the problem. If the government would just get out of its own way and let us kind of work here, we could do really great things. So that's been really helpful as well. But a lot of those in Pennsylvania, won't dwarf on this too long for the sake of your audience, but there's a permitting issue. Pennsylvania is consistently ranked, unfortunately, near the bottom states, bottom 10 to do business year after year. When states like Ohio, right to our west, we share a very large border with, are just dwarfing Pennsylvania. And the current governor, his approach is, well, they spend more money on XYZ. We need to do even more than they do. So the current narrative is, let's just keep throwing money at it without any ROI. Well, you can't do business that way. And by the way, you have a responsibility to the people to be a good steward of their money and our collective resources. And this is a terrible approach. And he has this whole permitting. The last thing I'll say on the permitting thing is, I appreciate the willingness to look at the issue that we are terrible with giving permits for businesses to grow and a lot of other things, right? And so he said, hey, if you don't get your permit in X amount of days, we'll give you your money back. Cool. I mean, if you're a business owner looking to do a $17 million expansion, you want your $300 filing fee back? But all the time you still don't have your permit? You have to start all over again? This is the exact thing, Jeff, we're talking about with people at the highest levels who are in charge of growth. There's very simple, policy things that work. Ohio has things like deemed approved. If you don't get it in so long, you're getting the permit, right? Now, there's some regulations on some of those industries, but my point is, throwing money at things hasn't always been the answer. And there's got to be some ROI, like put some thought into your processes. I've got a lot of good ideas if I could just get the governor one-on-one again and throw a few more at him.
Right. Well, and you talk about that, like that's such a great example of, well, we'll refund your $300 permit fee. Well, that's great. But most businesses, if you walk back in and say, hey, if somebody walks back into your store and says, hey, I bought this here the other day, but it doesn't work or it's not what I needed. As a business owner, you look at that as a failure. You're like, okay, well, we can't have this happen very often. But for government, they smile and go, well, here's your $300 back. And they're happy with that. I mean,
that's a win.
Right. Yeah. And it's not a win for anybody else in the real world, just for a bureaucrat somewhere. Let me ask you, what are some of the things, and we talked a little bit about it, obviously, extension of the tax cuts, some of these regulatory issues, but what are some of the things that could be done right now to help small businesses?
Right now, I mean, I'd say a lot of that is the worry, too, of what could come down the line. Things like the PRO Act, by the way, there's too much talk right now on that. And that's a concern. Let me give you a really good example. I have a member of ours who's a pretty large logistic company, transportation, semi-trucks, all kinds of things, right? And something like 70% of their operations are through independent contractors. The reality is a lot of independent contractors, and these are people who will say they own their own semi-truck, so they have their own LLC, and they say, hey, we want to do only the jobs we want to do. We'll pick and choose. And a lot of logistics companies work this way. If the PRO Act, which is a national effort to duplicate some things that happen in California, because we all know California usually has the best business policy, will take away this ability for independent contractors to even exist. We're talking 70% of just this one company's business operations. And that's one example. And all of them just be out of work overnight. And the federal government seeing this as some sort of a win. I mean, it's just such shallow without any regard to the economic effects, let alone just personal effects on small businesses and families in the area. So he asked me, what are some things that could help small businesses right away? It's let's stop using them as the boogeyman or some kind of scapegoat or whipping post, right? Too often they're seen as the bad person for cheap political points, but in the reality, they're the ones that's getting hurt here. We need to prioritize small business, not put them to the side. So some things that would help small business. And again, it's not an ideological issue. It's a small business issue. This isn't a right or a left or an R or a D thing. If we could collectively support small businesses, our economy could just go gangbusters. Because really, I think we want the same things, right? The reality is we want us to grow. We want small businesses to flourish. We want people to have good wages and family-sustaining jobs. We just have two different ways of getting there. And so we just need to kind of come a little bit more closer together and realize that we have the same goal in mind, the goal being success. But one way is going to help us a little bit more than the other. We just need to have more of those conversations as well.
Yeah. Well, and you talked like the PRO Act, you talked about that. To me, why would we take away people's freedom? Why would we take away their liberty, their right to choose? Nobody's forcing you to take a job as an independent contractor. You do it by choice. You choose to do that.
That's the American entrepreneurial spirit right there.
Of course. Yeah. And so we ought to look at these things through the lens of unleashing America's potential, American businesses' potential, individual Americans, their potential, letting them choose and decide how they want to work and what they want to do for a living. And it just seems like these other things like PRO Act and so many other things are meant to stifle that, take choices away from individuals and from people and send it off to government, send it off to the capital of a state or to Washington, D.C. and let politicians and bureaucrats decide. It's just a bad idea all around. So, Jezree, anything else before we go? Where can folks learn more about your association and what you do?
Yeah, so you can check us out online at mbausa.org. That's our website. Getting a new one, so I'm really excited for that to come out. So maybe give me a couple weeks before we launch it. It's going to be real exciting, a little bit more interactive. But if you're in the Western PA, Central Pennsylvania, Eastern Ohio, Western New York, we'd love to get in touch with you and plug you in to get more involved. Because it's really important, by the way, for businesses to reach out directly to their lawmakers, to educate also their employees on the realities of what some of these policies actually do and what they don't do. So check us out on our website. And if you're not in our area, please get yourself plugged in with an organization similar to ours that have the goal to see free markets or see businesses thrive within the free market system. Because when more of us are involved in things like that, it's going to be better for everyone.
All right, Jezree, thanks for joining us. I appreciate you.
Thank you so much for having us, Jeff.
You got it. All right. Well, look, Jezree just spelled it out for you. This is so critical to fight back on sort of these big government solutions, whether it's to healthcare or the economy, the PRO Act wanting to take away your individual freedom to work in the way you choose to work. And again, if you want to join a union shop, you should be free to join a union shop. If you want to join a non-union shop, you should be free to do that. If you want to work as an independent contractor, that should be your choice, not the government's choice. We have to extend the Trump tax cuts and give that certainty to American businesses that they can invest in research and development and that they can invest in capital gains and keep capital gains tax rates low. Those things are important. And if they don't have those assurances, it's going to cost American workers their jobs. And that's something they can ill afford at a time when government-caused inflation is running rampant. Thanks for joining us. Get out there, defend liberty and freedom. We appreciate you listening.
Thank you for listening to American Potential. You may listen to more stories from Americans working every day to expand freedom and opportunity in their communities by visiting AmericanPotential.com.